So tomorrow you guys have a quiz, so I thought I would go ahead and show you some of the answers to your worksheet, which is where I am creating the quiz from, or have already created the quiz from. And so it requires us to use our notes in from 5-4 and 5-5. We're going to do not all of them, probably about half of them. Let's start with number 1. We have the square root of 1 minus x equaling 7. And we need to get rid of that square root. So to get rid of the square root, I'm going to go ahead and square that square root. And what you do to one side, you got to do to the other. So this ends up canceling out with the square root, and I'm left with 1 minus x equals 49. I don't see any x squared, so I can just isolate my x and go from there. So I'm going to subtract 1 on both sides, and I get negative x equals positive 48. I do need to get rid of that negative understood negative 1 in front of the x, so I'm going to divide everything by negative 1. That cancels out, and I'm left with x equals negative 48, and that's my answer. Now, please make sure that if you have 2 answers, you go back and you check your solutions. It says to check your solutions for all of them, but I don't really want you to do them for all of them. Just do them in case you have 2 answers. So let's do number 3. It's the same idea, but it's a little bit more complicated. We have more numbers on the outside and inside of our radical. So if you remember the steps that I mentioned, the first thing you need to do is find any sort of adding or subtracting and get rid of it. So I have a plus 6 on the outside of my parentheses, or outside of my radical, so I'm going to subtract 6 on both sides, cancels out, and I'm left with 1/4 times the 4th root of 2x equaling 4. Next step is to get rid of any other numbers outside of the radical that are going to be multiplying. In this particular case, we have times 1/4, and to get rid of that, we are going to multiply by the reciprocal, which is 4/1. So this ends up canceling with what I'm multiplying by, and I am left with the 4th root of 2x equals, 4 times 4 is 16. All right, now, from here, I can take the 4th power of each side. You can take your calculator and type in 16 to the 4th power. And you should get 2x equals a really big number, 65536. So 65,536. And then it says to finally divide by any other numbers that are with your x, or subtract. In this case, we only have multiplication, so it's just going to be dividing. And we will get whatever our answer is divided by 2, which is going to be 32,768. And that's our answer. Again, you need to only plug it back in to check for extraneous solutions if you have 2 solutions. And we do not. We only have 1, so we don't have to worry about that. Number 5 is very similar to number 1, but in this particular case, instead of having just 1 term on a equal sign, we actually have 2 terms. And so we have to make sure that while we do this problem, we FOIL correctly. Some of you guys make mistakes foiling, so I just want to make sure that we are extra careful when this happens. So we have x minus 7 squared, so that which is because we have the square root of x minus 5. We have to get rid of that. These end up canceling out, and I'm left with, and I want you guys again to rewrite this as x minus 7, because it's easier to see what the next step is if you write it out that way. Now that I see my 2 binomials, I know I need to FOIL, so that's going to give me x squared minus 7x plus 49 is equal to x minus 5. Add your like terms. And once you are done, you can bring over your x and your 5. So this is minus 5, so I'm going to go ahead and add 5 to both sides. And I'm doing this at the same time just to expedite things just a little bit. X squared minus 15x plus 54 equals 0. Now that it equals 0, I can go ahead and find the solutions. It's as far as I can get. I have x squared, so I know I'm going to have to do my method where I am factoring. So you can do your diamond. Your negative 15 is on top. 54 is on the bottom. You can go ahead and set up your parentheses where it's going to say x and x. Please remember that this symbol here tells us that our symbols are going to be the same. And then this one tells us that our symbol is going to be, both of our symbols are going to be negative. So it should say x minus, x minus. All right, and so then I can list my factors of 54. I got 1 and 54, which is pretty obvious. I've got 2 and 27, 3 and 18, and 6 and 9. And since the highlighted symbol in green is positive, I know that in order to get my number, I need to be able to add. So even though I have 3 and 18 right here, the only way I can get 15 is if I subtract, and that's not what I want to do. I want to add. So I need to pick the 6 and 9 option. And after that, you set each parenthesis equal to 0 and solve for x. And you should get x equals 6 and x equals 9. All right, now we have a scenario where we have two answers. So we're going to go ahead and plug in both of them to see if one or both of them are extraneous. So I'm going to plug in 6 minus 7 equals 6, or the square root of 6 minus 5. 6 minus 7 gives me negative 1. 6 minus 5 gives me positive 1, but I still have that square root to deal with. So the square root of 1 is just 1. And so now my statement says negative 1 equals positive 1, which is not possible. So this is an extraneous solution. Plug in that 9 just to double check the next one. 9 minus 7 equals the square root of 9 minus 5. This gives me 2. This gives me the square root of 4, which is 2. So this one works out. So for this one, I do have an extraneous solution, and the only one that is my answer is 9. Number 8, this one is a little bit complicated looking, but once you realize that it's going to be very pretty and straightforward, it's a lot nicer. First things first, I need to go ahead and get one of the square roots on the other side of the equal sign. So I have one that's already negative, and if I move it over, it's going to change to a positive. So I'm going to move that one just to make my life a little bit easier. So I'm adding the square root, or 3 times the square root of x plus 1. And what I do to one side, I got to do to the other. Running out of room, but that's okay. That cancels out, and I'm left with the square root of 2x plus 2 equaling 3 times the square root of x plus 1. Because remember, it changes to positive once you add it to both sides. All right, I have the square root. I need to get rid of it. The way you get rid of it is by squaring. And so I'm going to be left with 2x plus 2 on the left. And this one I'm going to write out that step just so that we can see it. This is technically 3 squared because of the distributive property. 3 squared times the square root of x plus 1 squared. Okay, this ends up canceling out. So I have 2x plus 1 equals 3 squared is 9. And then my square root is just going to become x plus 1. All right, so now I have the distributive property one more time. 2x plus 2 equals 9x plus 9. All right, my x value, I do have 2 of them, but it is to the first power. So I know I'm going to have one solution, and I just need to isolate my x. So I'm going to subtract 9 on both sides, and 9x really. And I'm going to get negative 7x plus 2 equals 9. Bring over that 2, and I get negative 7x equals 7. Divide by that negative 7, and I get x equals negative 1. That is our final answer. All right, the last problem I want to do from 5.4 is number 12. And I just really want to point out that while you're doing this, it's always best to have a lot of room. So if you need to write things down on a different sheet of paper and just attach it, you can. The other thing is we have this variable, or not variable, we have this exponent right here, and it is attached to a parenthetical statement. So we have to make sure that if it's in parentheses like that, everything else on the outside has to be completely eliminated before we go inside of our parentheses. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to ignore that for a little bit, subtract the 28. I get the quantity of 6x plus 10 to the 7/3 power is equal to 128. All right, now that I have that, I need to get rid of this exponent. And how you get rid of it is by multiplying by another power, but it's got to be the reciprocal. So now it's going to be 3/7. And what you do to one side, you do to the other. So this cancels out, and I'm left with 6x plus 10 equals, and I'm going to rewrite this in radical form, the 7th root of 128 to the 3rd power. So take a couple seconds, plug that piece into your calculator, the 7th root of 128. And you should get 2 to the 3rd power, which we know what that is. That's going to be 8. And if you don't, you can always plug it into the calculator. And now that everything's done, it's just solving for x. Subtract 10 on both sides. We get 6x equals -2. Divide by the 6. And we get x equals -2/6, which can be reduced to -1/3. And so this is our final answer. And if you did plug it back in, it does work. I did double check it because sometimes when you do this work and it's not a perfect whole number, it does sort of raise some questions. But when you do this, it does work out after you plug it back in. For 5.5, go ahead and flip your paper. 5.5, I'm going to do 2 problems from 1 through 4, and then I'll do number 5, which is the multiplication. It does, in the original document, it did say to go ahead and divide as well, but you guys haven't really learned that yet, so you don't have to worry about that until later. But we'll go ahead and get this started. It says to go ahead and add and subtract on each one. So the first one I'm going to add -1/2 times the cube root of x plus 9/2 times the cube root of x. All right, since we're adding, we don't have to worry about our radicals. We just have to double check that they're exactly the same. And in this case, they are the same. So now that I have that piece completely good to go, I can just add my coefficients. So -1/2 plus 9/2 is going to be 8/2 times the cube root of x. Think about it like a like term. And 8/2 can reduce to 4 times the cube root of x. Okay, so that is our first piece. That's our first answer. After you're done with that, you need to plug in the x value that they give us, which is -1,000. So I'm going to plug that in. 4 times the cube root of -1,000. And it gives me 4 times -10, which equals -40. And that's my answer. All right, now that I've done that, I can go ahead and do the same exact process, but with subtraction. So it's going to be -1/2 cube root of x minus 9/2 cube root of x. Again, we're not multiplying, so we don't have to worry about our radicals and what's going to happen to them. We just need to add or combine the leading coefficients. -1/2 minus 9/2 is going to give me a -10/2 times the cube root of x, which is going to give me -5 cube root of x. So this is my first answer where I just combined my function. Second piece is just to plug it in. So it's -5 times the cube root of -1,000, which is going to be -5 times -10, which gives me a +50. All right, same exact process for number 2, but it's going to be a little bit longer just because of the fact that it's involving polynomials. So we have negative x squared minus 3x plus 8. We're going to add it first, add it to 6x minus 3x squared. Combine your like terms and put it in standard form. So I have 2x value, or x squared values. So that gives me negative 4x squared. Used it, so I'm going to cross it out. Negative 3x plus 6x, that's going to give me a positive 3x. I used them, so I crossed it out. And then plus 8. And then that's it. That is as much as I can combine. So then I need to plug in that 1. Negative 4 times 1 squared plus 3 times 1 plus 8. And really you can just plug in this entire thing into your calculator. Oh, actually it should be negative 1 for number 2. So let me change that. Negative 1, negative 1. Okay. So negative 1 squared is going to be positive 1. Positive 1 times negative 4 gives me a negative 4. The next piece is 3 times a negative 1, so that's negative 3. And then the plus 8 is just normal. And then I can type that into the calculator. I can figure out that's going to be negative 7 plus 8, or 1. And that's my answer. Subtraction. Remember, with this one, when you have subtraction, you need to use parentheses. You have to, otherwise it's going to throw everything off. So we have negative x squared, not cubed, squared, minus 3x plus 8 minus, and then here's where you use your parentheses. It's going to be minus 6x minus 3x squared. You're going to distribute that negative to everything inside of the parentheses. Everything. Don't just do it to the first one and forget about all the other stuff. So the first half stays the same, but the second half is going to flip all their signs. So it's going to say minus 6x plus 3x squared. All right, add your like terms. That should give you a 2x squared minus 9x plus 8. And this becomes our final combined function. Last piece is to plug in that negative 1. All right, that's going to give me negative 1 squared, which is positive 1. Positive 1 times positive 2 is positive 2. Negative 9 times negative 1 is a positive 9, because a negative times a negative is positive. And then carry down that plus 8. Type this into your calculator or do it in your head, doesn't really matter, but you should end up with the answer of 19. All right, last problem, number 5. Number 5 says to go ahead and multiply them. So the easiest thing to do when you're multiplying is to rewrite all of your variables with radicals in exponential form. So f of x is in exponential form, but g of x is not. So I'm just going to go ahead and quickly change that from the cube root of x to x to the 1/3 power. And that way when I multiply f of x times g of x, it will be easier to combine because I'm used to working with my variables being in exponential form. All right, so with this one, you're going to go ahead and multiply your coefficients, which in this case is negative 1 and 2, so that gives you negative 2. And then you're going to multiply your variables or with your bases, and remember your bases are the same, so you're going to add your exponents. Okay, if you type this into your calculator, you're going to get 3.3333333. And when you do that, remember you can figure out what that is equal to by pressing math, at least in fraction form, by pressing math and then number 1, it changes it into a fraction. Or you can do it the long way, 3/1, negative 2x, and it'll be 9/3 plus 1/3, and then you can finally combine them to get 10/3. Doesn't really matter which method you choose, and so this becomes our final combined function. After we're done, plug in that negative 64 and solve. We can rewrite this as the cube root of negative 64 to the power of 10, which is going to give me negative 4 to the power of 10. If I plug that into the calculator, it's going to give me a positive, because it's raised to a positive power, positive 1048,576. And I need to multiply that by -2 for a total of -2,097,152. So I wanted to do this one partially because the number is just so large and I didn't want you guys to feel like, oh, because it's so big, I must have done something wrong. Nope. This is the process for it. It's a little crazy, but it's still a lot of fun. All right, good luck on your quiz tomorrow, and this video will be posted on Portals. Please find it if you are unsure, and if you have further questions, just text me on Remind.